When the reservoir dropped below 12% capacity and Hawthorne County's water supply failed completely, leaving faucets dry and toilets silent across every home in the valley, the town council finally stopped pretending they knew what to do and sent a delegation to the one place no one wanted to admit still had running water. A farmhouse at the edge of town where Ruth Carver had spent 18 months building something behind a false cellar wall that everyone had called wasteful, paranoid, and completely unnecessary. 20 months earlier, Ruth had made a decision that turned her into the subject of every coffee shop conversation in Hawthorne for half a year. She bought drilling equipment, not the kind farmers used for irrigation wells. Those made sense. Those were normal. Ruth purchased industrial-grade boring machinery, the type used for deep geothermal systems, and had it delivered to her property on 3 flatbed trucks that blocked Main Street for an hour while they maneuvered toward her land. People noticed immediately. In a town of 1,100 where most families had lived for generations, where water came from the county reservoir and always had, the sight of Ruth Carver, quiet, 56, widowed for a decade, commissioning that kind of operation didn't just raise eyebrows. It started arguments. "She's drilling a private well," someone said at the feed co-op, shaking his head. "Like the rest of us aren't good enough to share water with." At the diner, opinions sharpened into something meaner. "Thinks she's better than the system that's worked for 70 years. But Ruth wasn't drilling a well. Not exactly. What she was doing was far more complicated and far more deliberate, though she never explained it to anyone who asked. She had hired hydrologists, studied aquifer maps, reviewed geological surveys going back 4 decades, and identified something most people in Hawthorne either didn't know existed or had long forgotten: a deep, isolated groundwater pocket beneath her property, fed by ancient runoff, completely separate from the county reservoir system. It wasn't large. It wouldn't supply the whole town, but it was stable, protected, and if accessed correctly, sustainable for years. So Ruth spent her savings drilling down 300 feet, installing filtration systems, running concealed piping underground, and building a false wall inside her cellar to hide the entire operation from casual view. Because she knew what would happen if people understood what she had. They'd want it. They'd demand access. They'd assume it belonged to everyone simply because they needed it. And Ruth had learned a long time ago that need didn't make people grateful. It made them entitled. The mockery started once the construction noise became unavoidable. For weeks, drilling equipment rattled across her land, and neighbors complained about the sound, the dust, the disruption. "What the hell is she building back there?" became a Chong question at the hardware store. When contractors finished and left, and Ruth began the final phase, concealing the system entirely, the rumors intensified. Someone claimed she was building a bunker. Another said she was tapping into restricted water sources illegally. A county inspector even showed up unannounced, demanding to see her cellar, but found only shelves of canned goods, a furnace, and stone walls that looked like they'd been there since the house was built. Because Ruth had been thorough, the false wall was seamless. The pipes ran hidden beneath concrete. The filtration tanks sat behind what appeared to be a solid foundation, and the access panel was concealed behind a rack of preserves that looked untouched for years. By the time winter came and went, most people had stopped talking about Ruth's strange project. It became just another piece of local oddity, something to mention when newcomers asked about the quieter residents. But Ruth kept working. She tested the system weekly, monitored output levels, checked filtration efficiency, and stored backup supplies in the hidden room behind the cellar wall. Because while everyone else in Hawthorne trusted the reservoir without question, Ruth had noticed something they hadn't. The water levels had been dropping for 3 straight years. Not dramatically, not enough to trigger alarms, but steadily, measurably, in ways the county reports downplayed or dismissed as seasonal variation. Ruth didn't trust those reports, so she prepared for what the data suggested was coming. Even as the rest of Hawthorne continued filling pools, watering lawns, and using water the way they always had, as if the supply would last forever. And then the drought arrived. Not all at once, but slowly, like a hand tightening around the valley's throat. Spring rains never came. Summer heat settled in early and stayed. Streams that usually ran year-round slowed to trickles, then dried completely. Fields turned brown. Dust storms rolled across the plains. And the reservoir, the single source of water for every home, every business, every farm in Hawthorne County, began to drop faster than anyone had ever seen. By August, the county imposed water restrictions. By September, those restrictions became rationing. And by early October, when the reservoir dropped below 15% and engineers warned it might fail entirely within weeks, the truth finally settled across Hawthorne like a weight no one could lift. They were running out of water. And the only person who had prepared for that possibility was the one they had spent a year and a half mocking. The morning the county water system failed, Ruth was in her garden pulling dead tomato plants from soil so dry it crumbled like ash between her fingers. She heard the change before she saw it. A hollow silence spreading across the valley as pumps throughout Hawthorne sputtered and died, one after another, like a chain of lights going dark. Inside homes across town, faucets coughed, hissed, and went dry. Shower heads dripped their last drops. Toilets wouldn't refill. And within an hour, panic spread faster than any official announcement could contain it. The county held an emergency meeting that afternoon in the high school gymnasium, where over 600 people crowded into bleachers, their faces tight with fear and anger. The water commissioner, a man named Dale Fenwick who had held the position for 12 years, stood at a podium and delivered news no one wanted to hear. "The reservoir is at 11%, he said, his voice barely steady. "At current depletion rates, we have maybe 10 days of emergency supply left. After that, we'll need to truck water in from outside the county." Someone in the crowd shouted, "How long will that take?" Dale hesitated. "State emergency services are already stretched across 4 counties. It could be weeks before we see consistent deliveries." The gymnasium erupted. Voices overlapped, accusations flew, and beneath it all was a fear no one knew how to name. The possibility that their town, their home, might become unlivable. But Ruth wasn't there. She was at home, standing in her cellar, checking the pressure gauge on her filtration system. The needle held steady. Water flowed clean and cold into the concealed holding tank behind the false wall. Everything she had built was working exactly as designed. She filled the glass, drank slowly, and allowed herself one quiet moment of relief before the knock came at her door. It was Dale Fenwick, accompanied by 2 town council members Ruth recognized but had never spoken to. They stood on her porch looking exhausted and desperate. "We need to talk," Dale said. Ruth didn't invite them in. She stepped outside and closed the door behind her. Dale cleared his throat. "We've been reviewing county records. Your property had drilling activity last year. Significant drilling." Ruth said nothing. One of the council members, a woman named Iris Holt, leaned forward. "We need to know if you have access to groundwater." "I do," Ruth said simply. The relief on their faces was immediate and overwhelming. Dale actually exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for hours. "How much?" he asked. "Enough," Ruth said. Iris stepped closer. "Ruth, we need your help. The town needs your help. If you have water, we can set up a distribution system, bring people here, ration it out until state support arrives." "No," Ruth said. The word landed like a stone. Dale blinked. "What do you mean, no?" "I mean I'm not opening my system to the entire town," Ruth said evenly. "It's not designed for that. It's a private supply on private land, and I built it for situations exactly like this." Iris's expression shifted from desperation to anger. "You're going to sit here with water while your neighbors suffer?" "I'm going to use what I built responsibly," Ruth said. "And I'm offering to help anyone who needs it on my terms. Not through county management. Not through distribution systems that'll drain my supply in a week. People can come here. I'll give them water. But I'm not handing over control." Dale's face tightened. "You don't get to make that decision. Water rights in this county apply to shared resources," Ruth interrupted. "This isn't the reservoir. This is a private aquifer on private land that I accessed legally. If you want to challenge that, call a lawyer. But while you're arguing, people are going thirsty." She turned and walked back inside, leaving them standing on her porch in the brutal heat. By evening, word had spread. Ruth Carver had water, and she was refusing to share it with the town. The backlash was immediate and vicious. People gathered outside the county. Offices demanding the council seize her property. Someone spray-painted "selfish" across her mailbox. A group of teenagers threw rocks at her windows after dark. But the next morning, when the sun rose over Hawthorne and the faucets remained dry for the second straight day, something else began to happen. A truck pulled into Ruth's driveway just after dawn. A man named Carl Zimmer, who ran a small ranch outside town, stepped out carrying 2 empty 5-gallon jugs. He walked to Ruth's door and knocked. When she answered, he didn't ask for charity. He didn't demand anything. He just said, "I've got livestock dying. I'll pay whatever you need. I just need water." Ruth studied him for a long moment. Then she nodded. "Come with me." She led him down to the cellar, moved the rack of preserves aside, and opened the concealed panel in the false wall. Behind it, Carl saw the tanks, the filtration system, the piping, everything Ruth had built while the town mocked her. She filled his jug slowly, carefully. "You can come back every 3 days," she said. "No more than this amount. Ration it. Make it last." Carl stared at her, something like shame crossing his face. "I didn't believe you," he said quietly. "When people said you were wasting money, I laughed." "I know," Ruth said. "Most people did." He loaded the jugs into his truck and left. And within an hour, 2 more vehicles appeared in her driveway. By the end of the first week, Ruth had established a system. People came to her door, not the angry crowds demanding access, but individuals, families, the ones desperate enough to set pride aside. She rationed carefully, tracking every gallon, making sure no one took more than they absolutely needed. Some people paid her. Others traded goods, canned food, firewood, labor. Ruth didn't refuse anyone who came respectfully, but she turned away the ones who arrived demanding, threatening, or acting like her water belonged to them by right. And slowly, something shifted in Hawthorne. The people Ruth helped began defending her. Carl Zimmer stood up at a town meeting and told the council flat out that Ruth's system was the only reason his animals hadn't died. A mother named Angela Ruiz, whose 2 kids Ruth had quietly supplied with drinking water, confronted a group spray painting Ruth's fence and shamed them into stopping. The anger didn't disappear, but it fractured, and in the cracks, a harder truth began to surface. Ruth had been right, and the town had been wrong. The county's emergency water shipments finally arrived after 12 days. Not nearly enough, but enough to stabilize the crisis temporarily. Engineers brought in temporary desalination units and began drilling exploratory wells in other parts of the valley. But everyone knew the real lesson. The reservoir had failed. The system they trusted for 70 years had collapsed, and the only person who saw it coming had prepared alone while they mocked her. 3 weeks after the water system failed, Dale Fenwick returned to Ruth's property. This time, he came alone. She met him on the porch again, the same place she'd stood when he demanded access to her supply. "I owe you an apology," Dale said. "We all do." Ruth didn't answer right away. She looked past him toward the valley, where the reservoir sat nearly empty under the relentless sun. "You don't owe me anything," she said finally. "You owe yourselves honesty. About what you ignored. About what you assumed would always be there." Dale nodded slowly. "The county's funding a new aquifer survey. We're designing redundancy into the system. Multiple sources. Better monitoring." He paused. "We're asking if you'd consult. Help us build it right." Ruth considered that. "I'll think about it." He extended his hand. After a moment, she shook it. By the time winter rains finally returned and the reservoir began to recover, Hawthorne had changed in ways that couldn't be undone. The new water system was designed with Ruth's principles: decentralized, monitored, sustainable. Homes began installing private catchment systems. The county passed regulations requiring water audits for new construction. And Ruth's name, once whispered with derision, was spoken differently now. Not with worship, not with fanfare, but with respect. She continued her routines, tending her garden, checking her hidden system, living quietly at the edge of town. But now, when people passed her property, they didn't see a paranoid woman who'd wasted money on unnecessary fears. They saw someone who'd understood the fragility of comfort before the rest of them were ready to admit it existed. One evening, as Ruth stood in her cellar refilling her own water glass from the concealed tank, she allowed herself a small, private moment of satisfaction. Not because she'd been proven right, but because the people who'd needed her most had finally learned the difference between depending on a system and preparing for the day it fails. And outside, beyond the false wall, beyond the valley where the reservoir still sat vulnerable under the same relentless sky, Hawthorne carried on, not the same as before, but wiser, humbler, and finally willing to admit that survival had never been about trusting what had always worked. It had been about preparing for the moment it didn't.